this is our last webinar for the year. We started doing regular webinars this year, and they've been a resounding success so far. I think we've had more than 1,000 different people attend our webinars for last 5 to 6 months, right? So it's been fantastic. We really enjoy doing this. If there are any topics that you would like us to cover, do let us know. Put it in the comments. Let us know in the email. Any suggestion would be greatly appreciated. This webinar is actually a result of one of our customers' suggestions, right? Like, so how it started was that they asked, hey, it's great that you're showing me all this data, but I don't really know how am I doing, right? Like, I don't really know, do I have a path from becoming a startup to a scale up, right? And am I doing the right things to get there, or am I going to lose momentum before I get there, right? Like, so that started a very interesting analysis on our end. We started looking at all sorts of different businesses, right? So right from startup, super small, right? Like just about making $100,000 a year, all the way till those making, more than $10 million a year. And we started looking at how are these businesses different, right? And a lot of different things came out. And we sifted through a ton of data. This took about a month and a half just to kind of sift through the data and come up with a few very clear trends, right? Like, and so we looked at those trends. We went back to some of our customers, spoke with them, and understood from their experience to come up with an idea of what does it take for a business to go from startup to a scale up, right? So before we jump into that, we have a great presentation prepared, right? Like, I'm just going to start sharing my screen. Okay. So we have a few slides. They're just visual aids. It's mostly going to be narration from my end. What do you think, right? Like, what percentage of recruiting and staffing and executive search businesses grow from being a startup to a scale-up? A startup is anybody doing a less than $1 million in annual revenue, right? Like, so if you had one off year of doing more than $1 million, but not the next year, then you are still a startup, right? Like, and a scale up, I would say, those doing more than $1 million to up to $10 million in annual revenue, right? Like, and if you are in Europe or if you are in UK, you can replace dollars with euros or British pound. Our analysis said, right, like about 7 to 8% businesses clear that startup phase, right? Like they go and go beyond $1 million in annual revenue, right? Like, so that's very, very low success rate, right? And one of the reasons that we think that is that a lot of founders don't really have very clear idea about what are the metrics, what are the benchmarks that they should be chasing. And I kind of look back into SaaS, right? Like, so Recruiterflow as a SaaS company, as a SaaS founder, we have a wealth of data benchmarks from, that we get from other founders, from investors, from, it's pretty much public data now, right? Like, so where we can understand how well we are doing as a business, right? So for example, there is a very popular thing called Rule of 40, which is especially applied to SaaS companies, where it says basically your free cash flow plus your growth rate should be greater than or equal to 40, right? Like, so that helps founders figure out whether they are doing, whether they are growing too slow, they are growing too fast, whether their burn is too high, too low, right? Like, it just helps you gauge, calibrate, and figure out how fast you should be growing to be a great SaaS business, right? So that's just one example, right? Like, so we when we started researching, we didn't really find any such great matrix, right? Like that matrix that can serve as a guiding light, as your North Star, as a founder, as an operator, to say, okay, we are clear of this. That means that we are running a great business, right? So that's what our aim is, to create benchmarks, to give you numbers that helps you objectively measure your business and gives you targets toward, to go towards, right? Um, so we will, what we'll do is we'll just dive into this presentation, right? Um, we already talked about this. Now, we looked at a lot of different data points, and there were two very clear emergent themes. And that is new logo, new client acquisition versus client retention. And the way these two forces play out, right? Like these are competing forces in any recruiting business, right? So as a founder, as an operator, right, like you always have a choice, right? Like whether am I going to spend my next minute servicing the existing client that I have, or am I going to spend that next minute going after new clients, winning new business, right? Like, so these are competing priorities with each other, and it applies to not just, your time, but also your, your budgets, your people, right? Like, so these are two biggest priorities that any startup business would have. And it's difficult to figure out whether am I allocating resources to each of these competing priorities in the right manner, right? Like, so these are the two first, set of two competing forces that we are going to discuss, and we are going to tie all the other metrics around these two competing forces, right? So now it probably will come as no surprise that startups are not very good at retaining customers, and scale-ups are fantastic at retaining customers, right? So we looked at our cohort, right, like cohort of our customers, and we saw that for a median startup, right, like 70% of the clients that they work with are new clients, and 30% are old, right? Like returning clients, right? Like, so we looked at data for 1 calendar year, right? Like, so it's 70-30. So startups obviously have to be good. They don't really have good at acquiring new clients, new logos. They don't really have a wealth of, past relationships, past clients to rely on. On the other hand, right, like it's quite intuitive to think, right, like a scale up or rather more mature business has a lot of clients coming back, right? Like they have had a book of business built over years, right? So which they can reliably tap upon to acquire clients. Well, that makes sense, but these are just some of the numbers, right? So you need to make sure that you are, if you're a startup, you have a much healthier retention than 70%, right? Like to go towards being a top 10% of in the growth, right? Like, so this is the median number. Then we isolated. Let's just look at the startups that are growing at highest top 10 percentile in terms of the growth rate, and did the same analysis for scale ups that are in top 10 percentile in terms of their growth rate. And just in case you are wondering, what does top 10 percentile in growth rate mean, right? Like, so for the year 2024, right, like we looked at data from December 23 to November 2024. Being in top 10 percentile means that you are growing a little about 20% in terms of your revenue year on year, right? Like, so if you grew more than 20% in 24 compared to 23, you are, just about at top 10 percentile of the businesses, right? So, so startups operate at 66 to 34 ratio, right? So 66 new clients to 34 clients, right? So again, these are top 10 percentile and percentile by growth. And scale ups, this ratio also shifts a little bit to 54% new customers versus 46% returning customers, right? So now if you see, right, like while as a startup you should figure out what's the best way to retain customers, because that's absolute necessity for you to go from startup to scale up, right? Like your client retention rate is absolute necessity. How fast you are growing, your momentum is entirely dependent on your ability to acquire customers faster, right? So take a minute think about it, look at the numbers, right? So um, startups have 70% new customers. That's the average startup, and 30% returning customers. However, a really, really fast growing startup has 66% new customers and 34% returning customers, right? So this startups are, of course, doing much better, not just in terms of sales, but they're also doing very, very much better in terms of retaining their customers, right? So they've figured out both of these things to grow very, very fast. And similarly for scale ups, right? Like this, when we actually looked into our data, the difference in scale ups is much more starker. But we have a lot of scale ups, right? Like that are not really growing that fast. In fact, the majority of the industry actually had decrease in revenue or margins in 24 compared to 2023. But as a scale up, right, like you are a scale up because you've already figured out how you are going to retain your clients, how you are going to consistently deliver results for them. But if you want to keep your momentum up, you want to be, go beyond that 10 million, you have to, scale your mastery of acquiring new logos, right? So figure out different channels that keeps you acquiring new logos. You retain them at a fantastic pace. So it really, really starts adding up, right? Like I think last quarter we came up with an ebook which spoke about importance of retention in recruiting, right? So just about 5% jump in your retention rate over 3 years or over 4 years period means that your business has already doubled, right? Like, so compared to a business that has less than your retention rate minus 5%, right? Like, so retention really, really, your ability to retain customers is a compounding factor, right? Like really helps you scale up very, really, really well. However, to keep your momentum up, you need to be master of acquiring new customers, acquiring new logos, and doing sales, right? So that's the biggest takeaway. If you're a startup, focus on retention. If you're a scale up, you want to go beyond that 10 million, keeping that retention really, really high, focus on sales, right? Like that's the key takeaway. And I know much easier said than done, but that's what it takes to be a top 10%. Okay, I will go to the next slide. So we looked at just the clients, but now let's take a look at from the revenue perspective, right? Like, so we saw that 70% of the clients for startups, right? Like 70% of the clients are new, and that means only 30% of the clients are returning clients. But those 30% clients contribute 46% of their revenue, right? So returning clients overwhelmingly contribute towards your revenue mix, right? Like, so you want to make sure that you master retention when you are a startup, right? So only if you master retention, you're going to go from startup to a scale up kind of a phase. And of course, the revenue contribution of returning clients drops a little bit when you go towards top 10% fastest growing, because these businesses are so damn good at acquiring new customers that they're constantly acquiring new customers. They're retaining them at a really, really good rate as well. But the revenue contribution of returning customers drops a little bit, just about marginally, but it does drop. And you will see a very similar story amongst scale ups, right? Like, so revenue from new clients is just about 32%, and it grows up to 37% for much faster growing for businesses that are growing much faster, right? So you have revenue concentration towards the customers that are returning, right? Like, so returning customers will always contribute higher in terms of the revenue. That's why retention is, if I had to pick, right, like gun to my head between retention and sales, I would always pick retention. And this is one of the metrics that always gets looked over, right? Like as founders, as operators, as recruiters, we are aggressive. We are, born to do a lot of sales, and that's what gives us a lot of adrenaline. But what really builds and scales businesses is not sales, but it's just retention, right? So this is the key takeaway over here. Now, so we understand how important retention is to both a startup and a scale up business, right? Like, so we try to see what are the metrics that lead to retention, right? So there were two very clear trends that came out, right? Like one is time to fill and fill rate, right? So the customers that you end up retaining, right? Like you have a 40% higher fill rate and you have 11% shorter time to fill, right? Like, and so, and it's very intuitive, right? Like if you deliver, right? Like if you keep delivering again and again for your customers and you deliver in time, right? Like you deliver, deliver results for them really, really fast. There is no reason for them to not come back to you, right? So that's what um, we found, right? Like, and again, these are numbers for averages, right? Like, so always remember, this is the number for 50th percentile, right? Like, so if you're doing above that, that's great, right? Like, but if you're doing below that, that means that you are one of the laggards. You want to make sure that you bring these numbers back up towards at least becoming the top 50 percentile in the market, right? Like, so you are doing better than half of the market. Um, okay, so this is the big picture, right? Like you want to focus on retention that drives repeat business, right? So once you have a client that keeps on giving you new searches, new job orders, new projects, the amount of additional business development effort for that additional dollar that you have in revenue reduces quite significantly, right? So purely, right, like if you purely look at from the perspective of how many minutes do I have to spend to get that additional $1 in revenue, right? Like what retention helps you do is reduce the amount of time, resources that you have to spend to get that additional dollar in revenue, right? Like that's why retention is so key to your recruiting business, right? Like you nail retention, crossing 1 million, crossing 2 million is going to be very, very easy. From there, how far you go depends on keeping the retention rate really, really high and still, being really good at acquiring new customers. Right. So yeah, like returning clients contribute about 40% of the business for, smaller businesses. And this goes towards 60% for larger businesses. We saw the mix exact numbers a couple of slides back as well. That being said, one of the trends that came out is that not all retention is created equal. So, so when we started looking at, okay, let's look at these, large scale ups, let's look at these top 10 percentile businesses, right? Like, what is it that they are doing that makes them, so creme de la creme, right? Like they're so elite, right? Like, and we saw that they have very high revenue concentration, and this is super counterintuitive, right? But the idea is that these fast growing businesses have figured out they have, a few key clients who are, whales, right? Like they call them whales. They are whales for them, right? Like, so they consistently keep giving them they have fantastic relationships with them, right? Like they have, over the years, they've cultivated relationships with not just one hiring manager, but across the entire org so that they are, able to, get business repeatedly out of them. And if one of the hiring managers that they have moves from, company A to company B, the hiring manager takes the search firm along with them to work with them in their new job, right? Like, so they figured out some of these things, um, but faster growing businesses have larger revenue concentration, right? Like, so what we saw was that you know uh, they have cracked a few really, really large and very, very consistent customers. And these customers contribute to a lion's chunk of their revenue, right? Like, so we looked at so if you ever land a customer like Microsoft or Amazon, you absolutely make sure that you deliver for them. You make sure that they keep coming back to you, that your hiring manager refers more hiring managers in the same org for you, right? Like, and so the top 10% of the customers, right, like across our user base, right, like they contribute to about 1/3 of your open jobs, right? Like, so, and more in terms of revenue, right? Like, so that is um, something to think about, right? Like, so um, your ability to retain customers, that's great once you figured that out. But your ability to retain the right customers, that's what takes you to be an elite business, right? Like, so just something for you to keep in mind. So almost all the top 10%. So we looked at the companies, enriched their data, and saw that, okay, what's common among those top 10% of customers, right? Like, so the customers of our customers, so these are invariably large enterprise companies who are constantly hiring. These have, you have established trust, and you are not working with just one or two hiring managers, but you are working with multiple hiring managers in the same organization, right? So you have the ability to maneuver inside an org, understand it, and keep on consistently delivering for multiple hiring managers over there. And you know what's going to come ahead of everybody else, right? So if your client is starting a new geography, they're building a new project, they're starting up a new team, whatever it is, your your unfair competitive advantage is that you know about this before everybody else does, so that you can start positioning yourself, you can start talking to the right people at the right time. So that's what these elite businesses have cracked for their really, really large clients, right? Like, so for a lot of our customers, right, like we saw that their customers are also startups. Startups are great, right? Like seed, Series A, Series B, they're fantastic. They are, relatively low maintenance, easier to get into. However, the sad reality is that most startups will fail, right? So that means that there is a Series A startup that's hot today, that's giving you 35% of the business. There's a very good chance that they will not exist next year if they can't raise their Series B, right? So as great as it is to get these fast growing Series A startups, Series A, Series B kind of startups, you want to make sure that you have a healthy mix of large enterprise, slow and steady kind of customers. Because once you have that, once you crack that, right, like you have an engine that's pretty much unstoppable for you to get to 10 million plus in revenue. Startups are great as well, but it's very tough to scale a business beyond 10 million when you don't know whether when your top 3 clients, whether they're going to survive next year or not, right? Like, so that's what's tough about having startups as your major customer base. But a great point to start, and great point, they are a great way to start building cred in the market, and then to move up market towards more larger established companies. So that's pretty much it in terms of presentation. Let me We talked about a lot of numbers. So I'm going to do a quick summary and wrap it up for you. So we define startups as any business that's doing less than 1 million in annual revenue, and any business that's doing more than 1 million, let's say 1 million to 10 million as a scale up. We are keeping a 10 million because what we saw is that, once a business crosses about $3 million in revenue, there isn't really a lot of change in terms of these different numbers, right? So it's just a pure linear kind of relationship. However, there is a very stark difference between let's say a $1 million revenue business versus a $5 million revenue business, right? So we just thought 1 million is a great benchmark, right? So when you're a startup, right, you're going to have a lot of new customers, you want to stay focused on client retention. That's your formula. That's your key to survival. That's your key to become, to cross that $1 million in annual revenue. Have a few consistent repeat customers who are giving you, let's say, 400,000, 500,000 of business every year, and you can make up for the rest by acquiring new customers, right? So that's the key. Now, as scale up, right, you keep getting better and better and better at retaining your customers. However, if you want to keep momentum, you want to go beyond that 10 million, the retention is not enough, right? Retention got you here. Now, while keeping the retention at that world-class elite level, you need to have a kick-ass sales engine as well for you to have the momentum to go beyond that 10 million kind of a range. And that's what we are seeing with, fastest growing businesses in our cohort. A couple of things that contribute towards retention, right? That's time to fill and your fill rate, right? So you should have your time to fill for retained customers is, decreases by around 11%, and your fill rate increases by about 40%. So it's quite intuitive. If you are able to consistently deliver results for your customers, they will stay with you. However, not all retention is created equal, right? So if you want to be, you want to scale beyond $4 or $5 million, go towards closer to 10 million and beyond in terms of your annual revenue, you need to have a few wins, right? So these are clients who consistently keep giving you job orders, right? So you have a large network of different departments, different hiring managers who keep giving you repeat business. And these hiring managers, when they move from, this client to some other company, they bring them along with you, right? So once you have an ability to land such large enterprise clients who are consistently hiring, have great employer brand, it's just easy to hire for them. You have good understanding. You have great relationships with HR, with hiring manager, with all the different departments. That's when just about 10% of your customers will end up contributing about 35%, about 1/3 of your revenue, right? So it's counterintuitive, but as large you grow, right? As you grow larger, your revenue concentration keeps on increasing, right? So as you grow larger, your top 10% of the customers will keep contributing more and more and more towards your revenue. So as a founder, as an operator, your job is to consistently keep finding that, okay, how am I getting to that, is my next customer that top 10% customer, right? So that's your key towards getting to 10 million plus in annual revenue. I hope that you learned something new in this last webinar of the year. Have a fantastic holiday, have a fabulous new year, and see you all in the next year.